So today I'm going to talk about my own field. This is a picture of my study site in Western Tanzania. And I want to convince you of the value of evolutionary theory as a lens for thinking about the dilemmas in conservation and sustainability. But I should note that I'm using conservation and sustainability interchangeably. And I know this can be very problematic, but for this particular talk, I'm simply going to be talking about behaviors that reduce negative externalities, of which biodiversity, loss of biodiversity is only one. So you'll see that it doesn't matter for this talk, even though clearly there's a difference between conservation and sustainability. I'm going to, this is the structure of the talk. I'm going to introduce you to the field, very briefly talk about Darwinian ecology, the reading that I suggested for this talk. Then I'm going to talk about conservation as restraint and conservation as cooperation. So introduce you to two concepts that are useful to think of from an evolutionary framework. And I notice here that I actually just nabbed these pictures yesterday from another talk, my work on comparisons of inequality across different subsistence systems. And I realized that here I'm demonstrating very nicely for Page the dangerous unilineal orthogenetic three-stage phase of evolutionary approaches. And you can really see that I'm going to come up with a very unilineal orthogenic framework here. And this picture is going to come back, so it's going to be embarrassing over and over again. So just to introduce you to human behavioral ecology, which also has been called Darwinian, we call Darwinian anthropology. It's well known as sociobiology. The term I prefer is evolutionary anthropology or evolutionary social science. And I'm just going to have to do this quickly, but what we do is we apply evolutionary and behavioral ecological models and concepts to the study of human behavioral diversity, just as if humans were like any other species. We study human behavior, therefore we're studying human behavior from the functional perspective of maximizing biological fitness, in terms of traits that are selected because of positive effects on fitness. We focus specifically on adaptive decisions when faced with particular ecological and social constraints, specifically focusing on the costs and benefits of different strategies. So the idea would be, if in environment X, do A, alpha, if in environment, well, I've got that wrong, but if in environment Y, yeah, do beta. And so this is sort of a contingency model. So the point is not that there are genes for behavior alpha or for trait alpha and genes for trait beta, but rather that we probably all share an evolved decision-making framework which leads us to evaluate the options under different sets of constraints in different ways, depending on the constraints. So if you're a biologist, I'd sort of point out that what we're talking about is one of the assumptions we make here is the phenotypic gambit, and that is we're kind of assuming that there's sort of infinite genetic flexibility and that basically any optimal strategy can be selected for and will be seen in a population. Now clearly that's a ridiculous assumption, but we're just going to stick with it for the moment and you'll see we come back to it later. And if you're an anthropologist, what we're really doing with human behavioral ecology is providing a sort of firmer theoretical foundation to environmental anthropology, well, generally to anthropology, or really to the social sciences. So for example, Eduardo talked about Stewart yesterday. I love Stewart's work, but really his concept of adaptation is extremely mushy. Somehow groups, societies, individuals adapt their behavior to the environment, but we don't really understand what the specific mechanisms are. And of course the same, well, he mentioned Rappaport. So one of the things we're trying to do, like many other anthropologists do, is sort of rescue anthropology from the kind of blind functionalism that is completely mechanism-free. We use tools, optimality models, to determine what optimal behaviors might be. We add game theoretical considerations into this, but of course optimality depends not just on the environment, but on what other individuals are doing who are updating their preferences based on what other people are doing. We use simulation to kind of try and work out under certain constraints what the optimal behavior would be, and lots of empiricism. And basically we're all field workers, and that's kind of why we're basically anthropologists. The field started in, sociobiology started in the 1970s, sort of famously with these two books, Dawkins and Wilson's book, Sociobiology, which both had chapters at the end on humans. And quite quickly, by 1979, Napoleon Chagnon, Bill Irons, and Richard, sorry, it's written small there, but the book at the bottom was two anthropologists who just decided to start trying to apply these ideas to humans. And with the idea that natural selection can operate not just on physiological traits, but on behavioral traits. Remember that physiological traits have been the focus of biological anthropology for a long time. So there was nothing new about applying evolution to humans. It was this focus on behavior that came out of the sociobiology revolution in the 1970s. In 1985, Cavalli, Sforza, and Feldman, Richardson and Boyd, and Bill Durham all produced books in the early 1980s recognizing that we need to consider culturally transmitted traits. Now, once traits are transmitted culturally, and so you have a sort of evidence, sort of demonstration of this, say with skirt lengths at the bottom there, or on the right, this is a sort of a distribution figure of the shape of different gravestones over time across a cemetery in New England. The idea is that once traits are transmitted culturally, obviously different kinds of traits can spread for different reasons other than just enhancing fitness. It would be nice if they do enhance fitness, i.e. if they're not maladaptive, but there are all kinds of other reasons why traits may spread. They may be associated with prestigious people, so then you would get an imitation of high status people. They may be more easily copyable. They may be frequency dependent, so if a certain number of people ever do it, everyone else will. And once you have these kinds of biases, what we call in social learning, those biases which themselves are a product of natural selection, you're obviously going to have different kinds of evolutionary patterns over time. And this is really, really important. And that field is sort of technically called cultural evolution, but really human behavioral ecology, cultural evolution, we kind of fold into one now without any sort of nomenclature sort of battles as far as I know. There were, of course, lots of objections to this approach. Does anybody know why this glass of water is here? Wilson at a AAAS meeting in 1975 when he started applying these ideas to humans, upset a lot of social scientists who, well, you'll see what their concerns were, apparently was doused with a bucket, not a bucket, a glass of water by somebody at the conference. There were lots of objections. Genetic determinism, I think I've already pointed out that there probably almost definitely are genes underlying the way that we make decisions, but these are extremely unlikely to vary between groups or between individuals very much. The variability arises from the context where natural selection and genes operate is on the decision-making mechanisms, the learning biases, etc. Of course, one can't deny the fact that evolutionary theory has been used for terrible atrocities in history. I'm sure I don't have to assure you that our interest in understanding the roots of human behavior are to try to make the world a better place, not a worse place. And I put the isms there just to remind myself that a survey was done by Eric Smith, who was the author of the reading that the students did for yesterday, the postdocs did for yesterday. Eric and another student did a paper on political attitudes. And because obviously, often people associated with evolution are kind of, people think, oh, they're going to be racist, sexist, kind of right-wing, all of these kinds of stereotypes that, often during the sociobiology debates were very much sort of leveled at the sociobiologists. But actually, this survey that they did showed that, if anything, the political views of people espousing evolutionary views were more to the left than those of sociocultural anthropologists. So that's saying quite something. We've been accused a lot of prioritizing functional questions, so looking at the adaptive value of behavior rather than looking at the constraints, the mechanisms of transmission. And that is definitely true of the early sociobiology, but we're really moving away from that now, so I think that's not so much of a problem. We've been accused of intellectual imperialism and Wilson did say that sociobiology was going to eat up all the social sciences. I think what you're going to see from what I present today, that we're integrating what we understand and our models with what is known from other disciplines, and I don't think this imperialism is a problem any longer. And this idea of human universals, actually, Michael sort of mentioned sort of biological anthropology and interest in human universals. And of course, you're right. I mean, this has been, a strong focus. But really, as behavioral ecologists, the whole point of using these models is to explore diversity, variation within groups, variation between groups. So, this is not something that can be kind of directed against us. So just very briefly, the paper that I allocated for today was this paper, early paper, 2003 by Dustin Penn, The Evolutionary Roots of Our Environmental Problems Towards a Darwinian Ecology. I hope some of you got to read it. It's really a nicely argued, fascinating paper in which he addresses what to do about these awful things, which are really driving the planetary crisis we're in: overpopulation, overconsumption, and pollutions. Overpopulation, he looks at what can we learn from evolution to understand how, when, and why people are willing to reduce fertility. This is actually kind of work that I work on much more than what I'm talking about today. Overconsumption uses models of this idea of conspicuous consumption and these kind of Red Queen arguments are sort of competing to, if you drive a Bentley, I'm going to buy a Jaguar and he's going to buy a Ferrari or whatever. So this idea of sort of constant competition driving these ridiculous levels of consumption that are way more than any of us need. And this also comes up with sort of evolutionary arguments for pollution, but very much to do with the externalization of costs, which of course is directly taken from economics. Now, the odd thing is, what you won't know from the article, is that Dustin never followed up on this. He never explored it, despite this wonderful paper. But he did bring out this edited book, which I just put up there because it's really useful for a graduate seminar in this area. You get readings from Hardin, you get readings from Ostrom, well, it's going out of my head. I know I have a paper in there, but I'm obviously not in that list. But some really nice papers that were published elsewhere that are put together to provide a very good understanding of the issues in terms of evolutionary perspectives on environmental problems. So jumping ahead, I'm going to talk first of all about conservation as restraint. Human behavioral ecology poses that conservation is a form of restraint, entailing short-term costs for longer-term benefits. And in this way, it's part of a broader suite of, so that's a definition. And so restraint or stinting basically entails short-term costs for longer-term benefits. And this is not something that evolution would preclude. Somebody asked at the very beginning about altruism. We're very aware of the fact that altruism, restraint and stinting are commonly seen. The most obvious example, of course, is parental care. I have this picture of a Totoga woman I work with because I remember her during a time of tremendous food insecurity, feeding all of her children and her going to bed hungry. We are obviously very generous and we restrain our own appetites to look after others. In this case, of course, the explanation is kin selection, but we see it in other species as well. This leopard takes a gazelle up a tree rather than eating it immediately, obviously for the benefit that he or she is not going to be disturbed by a predator. And of course, very good example with the woodpeckers who are basically working extremely hard, incurring huge costs in the early fall so that they have a nice granary of food to eat over the winter. So Ray Hames, who was a guy who appeared in Eduardo's lecture in the methodology book, had this nice idea of testing for conservation by pitting the predictions of a hypothesis for conservation behavior against hypotheses for efficiency behavior. And he did this because in the 1980s there was still, a lot of anthropologists pretty much engaging with adopting the ecological noble savage sort of mythology that I talked about yesterday. So he really wanted to find a way where we could see whether or not people were restraining in their use of natural resources. So the efficiency hypothesis is basically derived from optimal foraging theory, and a specific, well, and here he uses a specific prey choice model, which assumes that organisms need to acquire food to reproduce, reproduce and produce babies and obtain fitness. Obviously, it's not linear. And also that foraging behavior incurs opportunity costs, so that there are, you don't want to spend all your time out hunting because there's other things to do. So the optimal strategy would be to hunt, choose your prey as efficiently as possible in a certain amount of time. So the hypothesis there is that forager prey choice decisions maximize the rate at which resources are taken per unit time spent foraging. And this, there's an assumption here, and that is that your harvesting does not affect the regeneration of the prey, okay? So against this, he pits the conservation hypothesis, is that foragers' choices are influenced by the effect they have on the regeneration of the prey, and that they minimize, and that therefore their prey choices minimize the effects on the reproductive rate of species. Of the species they're depending on. And I forgot to say at the beginning, I'm going to go through these early, what I called here, these early, conservationist restraint, early tests, not because I think they're great, there are problems, we're going to come back to the problem, but I just want to introduce to you a very simple way of using HB evolutionary theory to come up with sort of testable predictions. And it's not what I espouse all of this. And so he came up, Hames came up with a simple sort of hypothesis for intra-specific prey choice. Let's just think with respect to age, that according to the efficiency hypothesis, you would kill prime-aged individuals, those with the most meat on, because that's the most efficient way that you can hunt. Whereas if you're a conservationist or you have a conservationist trait, you would kill animals of lower reproductive value, because they're going to have, taking them away is going to have less effect on population growth rates. And you can make the same kind of hypothesis for sex, although they're normally harder to test because males are normally larger in all species, so they're harder to differentiate the predictions. And of course, there's an assumption, there's always assumptions in models. One is that prime-aged individuals are as easy to catch as the young and the old, and that might be a problem here, of course. So Mike Alvar did a really nice study quite a long time ago. I'll give the reference in the next slide, of the Piro hunters who live adjacent to Manu National Park in Peru. And he was lucky because he could use the data from Cochacashu, which is a research station which had data already on the age-sex distribution of the prey species that the Piro were going against. So he had the baseline that he could compare the Piro offtakes against. So that's what you see here. I know there's too much information here. Let me just kind of highlight the things. So with howler monkeys, for example, the Piro kill sample is heavily biased towards the adult mature animals, but the background distribution of adults and immatures is very different. So there's a significant bias towards actually taking the mature animals, the adult animals, not the younger animals. And similarly with spider monkeys and collared peccaries, the data is a little more uncertain because there's different estimates of the background prey age sex structure. And then with deer and capybara, there's no bias at all. They're just taking the animals according to presumably how they encounter them. And so, he uses this as certainly no evidence for the conservation hypothesis and a little bit of evidence for the efficiency hypothesis. So just to summarize here, I think, what's really nice about this, despite the problems, I'll come to them, is there's a clear methodology, it's empirically replicable. We could go back to the Piro. We could see maybe after a, conservation intervention program or an increase in their population or a change in the population of their prey, do they change their behavior? It gives us a baseline empirical data against which we can test for conservation. I say consistent findings there because there have been a lot of subsequent studies with, mainly with neotropical hunting populations that find exactly the same effects. One of the nice things about this study is it avoids definitions based on outcomes. And this is something you will have read about in the Smith and Wishney paper. Epiphenomenal conservation outcomes are where you observe a positive conservation outcome. You observe a, no nasty negative consequences on the environment, but you misattribute those outcomes to sort of conservation intention among the actors themselves. So maybe, the hunters, the community have a very low ecological footprint, but it's maybe because of low extractive technology, low population density, maybe high mobility. For example, you might find, as you do with many of the Canadian, Alaskan hunting, foraging groups, they move when an area becomes depleted of prey, they go and hunt somewhere else. And this has often been interpreted as conservation behavior. But actually, there's an efficiency aspect to it too. If you think of marginal returns, when profitability in one patch declines, you move somewhere else. And so it may be pure efficiency. So this was Hunt's big push about epiphenomenal conservation. We have to be careful how we attribute our interpretation of cases where we see no negative environmental impact. And something I won't go into in detail here because I know I'm short of time, this definition or this way of studying conservation or trying to identify conservation also avoids definitions that are based on intentions and beliefs, which are normally somewhat more problematic, although I'm sure this is an issue we'll want to raise. There's a problem, however. You can't move away from this literature and say, these particular populations where the studies have done are not good conservationists because, of course, there's no evidence on, what's going on with sessile resources or what's going on with plants. And we know that very different trade-offs will affect the harvesting of those kinds of species. And I just want to point very quickly to, some problems with terms in the definition, in that restraint, if you see restraint, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a good conservation outcome. And I refer here to work actually by a previous grad student of mine, Laurie Rattan, working on the SASI, that I know many of you work on fisheries here, so you know that this is a sort of taboo system on prohibitions on hunting or on fishing in many different parts of Indonesia. And what she found is that by prohibiting fishing at certain times of the year, you actually increase your efficiency at other times of the year. So just because you see prohibitions, it doesn't necessarily mean this is conservation. Another point is conservation doesn't necessarily have to incur costs, really. And this was an example was given in the Smith and Wishy reading where they talked about contour ploughing. I don't think that contour ploughing is any more expensive in terms of time or effort than ploughing up and down the mountain, and yet it is a conservation technique. So, and then finally, epiphenomenal outcomes, even though I said they're not, we have to be careful about using them to determine whether or not a group are actually sort of behaving as conservationists. They may be extremely interesting to study in terms of trying to design solutions or think of solutions or determine what are the causes that are leading to the environmental degradation that we're seeing in a particular area. So I just want to, I can't solve this, but I just want to alert you to some of the kind of more sort of philosophical and definitional problems involved in this approach. And really to lead us on to what I think is a more sort of productive way of thinking about this whole question, a real question is where, when, and how might conservation arise? And I think these are interesting, I would follow with that. So I have three different reasons, three different factors I'm going to consider here. The first is that it's more likely to arise when the intrinsic character of the resource is stable and predictable over time. Secondly, we have to consider issues of time discounting, how an individual's evaluation of the benefits of a conserved resource decay over time. And thirdly, we need to have to consider property rights. That is, how sure an individual can be that somebody else won't steal the resource that they're conserving, that they're bearing the costs of not taking at the moment because of expecting to be able to take it in the future. And these are, the property rights issue is actually going to sort of come up again, really is explored more with the concept of cooperation that I'll get onto closer to the end of the talk. So with respect to the intrinsic character of the resource and the question specifically of does it have a predictable value in the future, generally restraint will only pay off to an individual if he or she can be sure of benefiting from this restraint in the future. one way of thinking about this is focusing on whether the resource will have a value that persists into the future and for which there's no alternative substitutes. And a single example, just look at the guy on the right. So a way of thinking about this is if a predator, let's say a bushback, stumbles into your village, there's not much point refraining or stinting on taking it if you can't be sure that it won't be there again tomorrow, or that somebody else might not take it tomorrow. So the payoff to conservation is only going to be materialized if you're sure that that value will be available for you the next day. The next, a more controversial example, and one that maybe we'll want to discuss more in the question time, is that is this question of why do pastoralists keep such big herds? Ecologists have often argued that pastoralists keep herds at unsustainable levels and that this leads to overgrazing. And the idea that I'm going to propose, and this builds off Swift and Ellis's work, is that pastoralists lose so many of their cattle, much more to drought and also to raids and disease, than to density-dependent factors. And so, I mean, this is just data that I draw for a class because a wonderful paper by Swift and Ellis, they just don't produce anything visual, and so it's kind of hard to see. But what you can see here from my little shot here of the blackboard, of the whiteboard, is that cattle mortality is almost, is hardly sensitive at all to population density. In single-year droughts, there's slightly higher mortality in areas with high population density, but in multi-year droughts, there's really cattle die irrespective of population density. And this is, of course, the same for disease, and the same for mortality or loss from raiding. So the point here is that it just doesn't make sense to reduce your cattle holdings because the mortality or the loss of your cattle is not dependent on how many you have. And so under these kinds of circumstances, you wouldn't expect conservation to arise. So, oh dear. So the more general argument that is developed from this kind of insight is that stochastic environments will favor opportunistic strategies, whereas systems that are closer to equilibrium will favor restraint. Now, this kind of seems like an interesting prediction, but as yet, I really don't know much data, at least in human harvesting, to actually assess this prediction. And what I do know actually goes the other way, I'm afraid. So a study by Chapman a long time ago in the 1980s, I think, looked at the evidence of kind of conservation taboos and environmental protection across different Pacific atolls. And he found that you actually get much more concern with protecting the environment in the atolls that are most frequently hit by hurricanes. Now, if you think back to this hypothesis, those are the ones where people shouldn't care about conserving for the future because the future is uncertain, everything might be lost with a hurricane anyhow. And a little bit similar comes from the ecological noble savage idea, which very much developed amongst anthropologists working in the Amazon. And Alan Stearman pointed out that most of those myths actually came from anthropologists working with groups in these black water areas where the environment's extremely unproductive and where shortages of food are most common. So those are the people who you would expect to, again, according to this model, to be least concerned with conservation and with looking after, thinking about the future. And so I think what this points to is that we really need, and there may be people in this room who know much more about this than I do, but we really need collaborations with environmental psychologists to look at what features of resources people are sensitive to, how they change their behavior in relation to the signal that comes from the resource. And maybe it is that just if you live in a really nasty environment, and this is something that Lynn Ostrom said, if you live in a system where resources are really difficult to get hold of and you have frequent shortages of food, you're actually going to be psychologically become more acutely aware of changes in the environment. Time discounting, this is obviously a tool that came from economists. The idea is people have known for a long time that people prefer a present consumption over future consumption, and time discounting is a tool designed to capture how a person's valuation of a good declines as a function of how long she has to wait for it. The decay function over time is often referred to as a discount rate, and people who think little about tomorrow have a high discount rate. And you can see that if you don't value the future very much, you're unlikely to stint or show restraint or manage your resources sustainably for the future. So what has evolution brought to this? Well, good news and bad news. The bad news is that generally our discount rates are very high. Simply what they show, discount rate is a function of R, which is the relatedness you have to the next generation, T, which is generation time, and P. Let's hold R and T constant and simply consider P. And really what the intuitive understanding of this is, in populations that are growing fast, you bear rather little relationship to the future generation. Or if you restrain reproduction, by restraining reproduction, you're going to contribute to offspring later, and offspring that are born later in a growing population make a smaller contribution to fitness. This is probably an argument that's familiar to many of you. So in growing populations, you don't want to be a conservationist. That's the argument here. And well, what do we know about human populations? Well, most people think of humans as case-selected. A lot of us anthropologists don't believe that at all. We can have, up to 15 kids. And we know from hunter-gatherer populations that they can go through times of rapid increase and then rapid crash again. And so our understanding of the Pleistocene is that humans are this weedy species who would reproduce quickly, rush into these kind of new habitats, face problems, die out. And so we're a weedy, fast reproducing species. And so that means that, that's the bad news, that we generally have high discount rates. The better news is that our discount rates are hyperbolic. This is from empirical evidence. Our discount rates are hyperbolic and not exponential. And that's because we are related to our offspring and our grand offspring, so we do care about them a little bit. I'm not going to present any data on this, but there's individual differences in sex and age and discount rates. Where, it's commonly known that women are much better conservationists than men. And there's also some obvious age effects that are associated with reproductive value that I was talking about in the prey species before. We know that discount rates are subject to priming, and I just wanted to draw your attention very quickly to a study done in Holland, looking at, this is trying to determine indifference points. So these Dutch subjects were shown either a movie on nature or a movie on sort of urban environments. And then experiments were used to determine the indifference point. And basically what this figure shows is that the ones who were exposed to nature are much more likely to take even 115 or 120 euros over 100 euros after a period of 90 days than are the people associated with who saw the urban movie. So what we draw from this is that the discount rates of the people exposed to urban scenes were much higher. I know it looks lower, but it's much higher in terms of the discount rate than those exposed to nature movies. And this is another interesting thing. Maybe all these nature programs are not so bad. Discount rates are also, of course, vulnerable to alternatives. And I'm thinking here of the famous work by Clark, which really says that, while you could harvest whales at the maximum sustainable yield, if the natural rate of whales in the ocean is higher than the rate at which you're harvesting them. But if the bank offers you a higher interest rate, basically, you can just kill off all the whales, put the money in the bank, and at the end of a certain period, you'll be richer. And so we always need to think about the alternatives. This is obviously really key in populations that we look at. And then finally, I just want to mention property rights. Property rights, really interesting work by Alan Rogers, looking at, we tend to think that property rights will reduce discount rates, but it actually, you could really destroy the soil on your farm and then, sell it for real estate development or something like that. And just because you own it privately doesn't mean there are no incentives for not getting as much out of it as possible and then selling it. This is what Rogers calls the tragedy of the sole proprietor. But even more interestingly, he does a model where he looks at People think, well, if you've got your own property and you pass it on to your kids, surely you're going to look after it well. But he actually shows that, if you have more than 2 kids, there's going to, the property itself is going to get subdivided, or some kids won't actually get an inheritance, and that then changes the whole dynamics of the model, that the inheritance is no longer certain, and therefore you just go for basically the tragedian outcome again. So, and finally, we know that discount rates vary extraordinarily between different communities. Sorry about these box numbers there from my class, which relate to my textbook, which you should all have read. So high discount rates, there's a really nice example here from the Aceh, where their forest was, they received 2,000 hectares in the early 1980s to manage as an indigenous reserve. And this one community, Chupapu, sold all their valuable labor, all their valuable hardwood for lumber. Basically, people kind of behaved as if a tree belonged to them. They found a logger who'd come in, sold them the tree, got some money, bought a boombox or some cool clothes. And as the anthropologist Kim Hill said, by the mid-1988, there was no evidence of any community newfound wealth. Whereas the Aceh living in Arroyo Bandera seemed to have a much lower discount rate, and that they all got together, they had a meeting, they decided on a sort of sustainable management program, they just harvested a few trees a year, and they used those profits to fund a schoolhouse. So this is obviously where Ostrom's kind of work comes in, what's going on here, and as a behavioral ecologist, the kind of work we would do here is the experimental economics, try to understand different notions of trust, heterogeneity in the community, what kinds of factors influence this. Property rights, we all tend to assume that once you have property rights, everything is going to be okay. And I certainly don't want to contest the idea that giving property rights to, often to indigenous or local communities, can be a super way of helping to exclude illegal extraction, like we see in the Xingu case of Eduardo's. But there are interesting wrinkles even to this. So Louise Fortman, in a really interesting paper, was brought in to see why a program that was actually directed to try to get women to plant trees in Zimbabwe to counter deforestation. They were, trees were given to every homestead, and they looked at sort of, how the men and women got involved in the sample, in the tree planting activity. And they just couldn't believe it, that even women are totally strong enough to plant a tree and look after it. They do most of the agricultural work anyhow. Men were much more keen to uptake this intervention rather than women. And what Fortman realized was that once what she realized is that women, the rates of divorce are really high in that area. So you're living, and it's a patrilocal residence system. So women are married to a guy and they're living on his plot, and somebody comes along and says, hey, plant trees. And they think, well, trees take 3 or 4 years to produce fruit, right? He's likely to have divorced me, or I'm going to have left him by then, because the divorce rates are very high. So they just didn't uptake it. Once they went to the community lots, although people were slightly less likely to plant trees, the sex difference disappeared. So you have to, property isn't the golden bullet that it's often sold as, even though, again, just thinking about this from the sort of constructs of evolutionary thinking, behavioral ecology, we can sort of come up at least with a post rationale on this. So these questions, I think what I'm going to summarize from this is that we're more likely to get good outcomes. I've been talking about traditional communities, places on the other side of the world, but as a behavioral ecologist, you're interested in humans, you're interested in human behavior, human nature. Everything I'm saying is just as relevant to the populations of here and now in urban cultures than anywhere else. But so what we've learned is that focusing on stable and predictable resources does make sense in terms of trying to elicit conservation behaviors, sustainable behaviors. But we really have to remember the complexities of perception and these kinds of these kinds of issues that psychologists may have really be able to help us in terms of how people perceive and value resources. I don't think we know very much about that. Time discounting is obviously critically important, but we need to recognize it, but we also need to think about how we can actually manipulate time discounting. And so, for example, if a factory is polluting there should at least be regulations in place that these pollutants should either have a bright pink color or they should stink or something awful, so as to help elicit the response from communities who are being negatively affected but won't otherwise be aware of it, or at least not directly aware of it. And tenure is obviously important, but we have to think about it in quite a nuanced way. And actually I will just end with this. This is an old figure and it's kind of problematic, but it's a really nice way of putting together some of the stuff that I've been thinking about, of scales, of, conservation interventions, sustainability interventions are only really going to work when the scales overlap nicely. So, who profits and who pays should really be at the same area. So, you're going to have most success across this axis. And so recycling is good because you actually bear the cost in the household, but you also get the benefit, at least if you live in a state where you get money back. Spotted owl controversy, for example, was kind of difficult because the profit was really at the national level, the idea of having this rare species, endangered species, but the cost was either at the individual, I've lost my mouse, the individual, or maybe at the regional level, I'm not sure. And clearly, actually there's an awful lot one can argue about this figure, and it was done a long time ago, but I think it's kind of useful in starting to think about how these payoffs, how they're distributed across different actors. And of course, the height of this figure reflects the mean lag time of cost and benefit, and so obviously, even back in 1992, when actually this is a more recent constellation of this figure, but Lowenheiner made the argument first in 1992, that climate change obviously takes a long time. We incur the costs now, and the benefits are going to be really enjoyed mainly by our offspring, our great-grand offspring, whatever. So Darwinian ecology. Penn hoped that the label would catch on. It didn't. Thank goodness, it's a horrible term. All ecology is Darwinian anyhow, right? But so, although his label didn't catch on, I think, the main point I've tried to say here is that interdisciplinary, I hope that at least I've conveyed, is that interdisciplinary barriers are really dissolving. Human behavioral ecology was seen as really unpopular and a horrible way of going about studying human behavior, sort of links very closely to what's going on with political scientists, psychologists, anthropologists, institutional economists, and biologists, insofar as we develop theories of the costs and benefits of different behavioral strategies. We're interested in evolved preferences, and of course we use the methods of game theory and experimental economics, although I didn't have time to talk about them. And so I think what human behavioral ecology does is gives us a better understanding of human tendencies, how they vary, and potentially how they can be contained or harnessed. Thank you very much.